Okay. So, a couple things we're going to do today. You guys, David came yesterday and played around with the server stuff, and you guys are all cool with the server, right? It works perfectly. You're totally clear what's going on. Everything is smooth.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Sure? Okay, so moving on. I promise, we'll come back and we'll do some more, but I'm going to go over it again. I'm going to blast through a little bit of this stuff because a little bit of this stuff is stuff either you've played with already or we don't need it for a couple more weeks. Okay? But I'm going to introduce it now because we're going to introduce all the way through to doing kind of some of the cool drag and drop stuff that's really helpful for doing an editor. You can do the entire editor thing by just building some forms. I highly recommend that you just use the grid format and put the forms in the bottom kind of area and the editor window at a certain area to get it working. Once it's working, just with some buttons and forms, then you can start to add some of this stuff. So as an approach, we want to solve the problem in the fastest, simplest way possible, and then test it out a little bit. In other words, how painful is it to use, and then work on areas to make it easier to use. So, a button on your screen, new level, right? In the form, level name, level parameters, and then you want to place objects, collidable objects. You want to place your cannon, and you want to place the targets. Now I have little flapping birds as targets. I have a pretty stock kind of cannon. I just did it all with the CSS. And placing those things can be as simple as push the button to place the thing, fill out the form, put it at this X, this Y, this width, this height. Okay. For placing items, you probably want a library of things. You're going to place multiple copies of them. And the real methodology here is that you want to go to the server and say, give me the list of all of the kind of, I guess for the lack of a better term, prefabs that I have. Make a unordered list of them. And when I want to place one in my level, I'm going to select one, and I'm going to choose where it goes in the level. I'm going to copy it. That means from the HTML perspective, I'm going to make a new div, and I'm going to give that div all the same properties and parameters as the original, except for its position, X and Y. So I can make a full copy of it. And jQuery makes this pretty easy to do. You can put the HTML directly in a jQuery element. That'll create the element, and then you can append it to a parent, like the editor window. And then you can set its CSS. So there's a set of things. When we're playing around with these things, we're playing around with some graphic stuff, and you very quickly, once you can do those basic operations, we'll decide that selecting something, going to a form to enter the X and Y as to where the new copy should go is very painful. It's not fun to do, and it's prone to mistakes, not to mention how do I select something or know what's selected. So where we can manipulate these things a little bit more easily, we'll start to introduce some cool CSS stuff and some cool HTML stuff to give you an interactive kind of experience. Now that usually starts with some of the background stuff we've talked about before, where I direct people to use CSS backgrounds rather than IMG tags. And they actually give you roughly the same results with two real differences that I've noticed. The first one is those image tags typically want a width and height, and they don't scale nicely. So they want the width and the height of the actual art asset to be identical to the width and the height of the div, and that's the way it is forever. Whereas background CSS images, using a URL, you can choose the background size and make a percentage scaling on it, and it'll use that scaling. So if you change the size of the window or the div, it'll scale with it. The other thing is that those background CSS things, as long as you've enabled the hardware on your browser, will use the accelerated graphics hardware, which on these machines is orders of magnitude faster than the CPU. So anything that we want to make dynamic, we want to make with a background CSS image. And we can do some fancy things with them. The first thing is, most of the image tags and the background images will use all sorts of different image formats. The graphic interchange format is kind of the old school format for images on the web. It's not very small necessarily. It has some nice properties if you want to do simple animations in them, but they're fixed. In other words, if you create an animated graphic with one of these, and it's 5 frames of animation, it's always 5 frames of animation, and it always plays out at the same rate. Just because it's 5 frames doesn't mean it's going to take, you know, a quarter of a second to play. It's however long you decide that thing is, and you can't interrupt it. It's just going to play. JPEGs are lossy. That means the JPEG image is smaller, but it also loses some fidelity, and if you had to zoom in on it, that would be a problem. PNGs have what property that we all love? Alpha. So we can make a box very easily in the web. It's a div. And if we put a background image on it that has some alpha on it, all of a sudden it looks like some fancy art. Because the alpha just is transparent, you don't see it. And you can also make different levels of alpha. There's up to 255 levels that you can get to. So we like this for making any kind of interactive things, because they can layer over top of each other and move around, and we can see behind them and stuff. And again, because they're using your accelerated graphics hardware, it doesn't really have a whole lot of problems layering for semi-transparent things on each other. It's really not a big deal. So we can use this to make animations. And to make animations, all we need is CSS. CSS does this nicely, right? It can take a sequence of images and it could rotate through them. And there's a special CSS animation function to do this, and we can hook up our animation. So one of the things I do with my little bird is I give him a little flapping animation by taking him into Photoshop and making a bunch of layers. And then I save that out as a sprite sheet. A sprite sheet is just a bunch of animation frames tacked side by side. Now, Photoshop is the one I like to use for this because Photoshop has an export tool built into it that takes all the layers of your Photoshop diagram and spits them out as a single image that's got all the layers. Okay. The only trick is you got to make sure all the layers are exactly the same size. Then we can use some CSS to show them in sequence. And we'll show you how to do that. The other thing we can do is we can apply translations, rotations, and scales. In fact, we can apply any transform, 2D or even technically 3D, to any element in the web. Yes, we can take a div and we can scale it, move it, and rotate it. All with CSS. Okay. Now the typical way we take advantage of these things is we will build those transformations in CSS. We'll attach them to a class, and in JavaScript we will add and remove classes. We try and make sure that in JavaScript we're doing things at the highest level possible. And part of that is just kind of what we call separation of concerns. We want to have our application built in a way that we're taking advantage of the languages and tools that we have. Use HTML for HTML stuff. Don't write JavaScript to do HTML, right? Unless there's something that obviously makes sense, something highly repetitive. Write CSS to do styling stuff. Don't go into JavaScript and add a million different styles to something with JavaScript, right? Just add a single class, put the styles in a class. Why? Because at some point in the future, you're going to want to add another style to that thing, and having to go back to the JavaScript, find it, add it, is generally harder, and you have to rebuild the application if you're going to deploy it, than just simply adding that style to a CSS class. Okay? So use CSS for things that CSS does well, use JavaScript for the things JavaScript does well, use HTML for the things HTML does well.
So for example, for the objects we're building the level, we should create a CSS class for each one of them. For example, oh, this one has this image, this background, for example.
Yeah, so you might create a class that has the image scale, the width, the height, right? And then just create a div with that class. Because the div is the HTML thing, it's just a box, it's a placeholder. And you can use the CSS to determine what it looks like. And if you want to change the image, you go to the CSS and change it, you don't have to change any code. Right? And when you change it in the CSS, maybe the image is a new size. Well, maybe it goes from 70 by 70 to 80 by 80. So when you change the image, you should probably also change the width and the height in the same spot, instead of having to have the JavaScript know about that. It just adds the class, which resizes the div. Right? Now, when we add things to our level, it's a little bit different. We want to select one thing and say, make a copy of it here. So what we're really going to do is we're going to take a look at that one thing and go, what's your width, what's your height, where's your top and left? Make a new thing with the same width, the same height, the same class, and set your top and left to a different position.
All related to the div of the level editor. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you can use either relative or absolute positioning for that. Right. And whenever we're building game type stuff, which is going to be rare, honestly, but that's where the absolute positioning kind of helps you. Right. You're not doing kind of like user interface form stuff where you want it to squish and shrink as you move the screen. If you go play a web game on any web portal, you'll find that there's almost always like the game is in a box in the center of the screen kind of thing. And no matter how much you change your browser, that box kind of just stays the same. It's because when we're building game type stuff, we're typically manipulating things pixel by pixel anyways. So we might as well just freeze it. All right, let's see. Look at that, make that go away. Yeah, let's come out of this guy and take a look. So, the kinds of things we're gonna do. We're gonna do some animation, okay? And again, I'm going to come back. I'll bring this deck back and the demo back when we go to do it. But here I've got a sprite sheet. This is just the one I stole from Java. And in this sprite sheet, I have an image. The image is a fixed size. Okay? That's the image tag showing you the exact image. The animated guy is flipping through them one at a time. Now here we're using CSS to take this image and scroll it behind this div. So the way you think about these on the web is I've got this guy. I don't really even have a piece of paper here. I have a piece of paper. So if I put my little guy on an image, when I'm running an animation in CSS, what I'm doing is I'm creating a div, and I'm going to use the background image, and I'm going to move the image behind the div, not the other way around. I know it's weird, right?
Yeah.
Okay, this doesn't move across the images. This stays fixed on the page. The image moves behind it. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the background position CSS. We're going to set the background position to start at 0, 0 here, as this div is going to be displayed with its overflow hidden, so you can't see anything around it, automatically clips. And then every frame, what we're going to do is we're going to move in the negative direction, however wide the image is. Make sense? there's 10 images exactly in this. So it kind of works nicely from a math perspective, right? So we can do that, because that's in a div, I can attach other things to it. So just as a way of demonstrating, the next arrow here is just an image with some alpha in a div. And I can turn any div into a button, right? Because I can handle a click event on that div. So when I click on this div, I can then attach a new class to this div. So the next arrow here has a second animation on it, which is bounces. And when its click handler got triggered, it applied a transform to this guy over a certain amount of time. It just did a translation. The cool part about it is, you notice he kept animating the whole time, right? So now I got an animation inside a div that I can move the div. Well, I can twist, I can rotate, I can do whatever I want with that div. I can put it in another div. Okay. So that's what we kind of want to do with the animation side of things. Now, to play with this, what we really kind of need is some art, which we can grab from the internet at any time, but you got to look for things called sprite sheets, and they're typically PNGs, and they'll have a series of images in them. And then we need to create the right DOM elements or the right HTML elements to put our animated stuff on. So we're going to have a class which has got the image attached to it. We'll probably have a separate class that has the width and height, and it'll be the width and height of a single frame. And then we're going to use CSS animation to trigger it to happen. We're going to put that animation in a class. Okay. So we're going to use these background capabilities, not just the background image, but we're going to use its size and position. So the size will give us a scaling, right? Now if we make the background size 100% by 100% like we normally do, then what it'll try and do is take that 10 frames and squish it into the div. We don't want that. So if the div is 50 pixels wide and the image is 500 pixels wide, we need to go 10 times to make sure the scale is set correctly. Are you following the math? Okay. So what we'd end up doing is set the image size to be 100% vertical, but we would send it to 1,000% horizontal for 10 frames. Right? Because that's 10 times size. That gives me 10 frames. That means the image gets stretched out 10 times the size of the div. Right? And by using percentages, I get it the same size as like relative to the size of the div I'm putting it in. Yeah.
For those sprite sheets to go have a lot of columns, for example.
Yeah.
I would go like 5 and then go to like 200 and then go to you're moving the behind it.
Yeah, so the position tells you which part of the image to start at. So the default's 0, 0, which is always the upper left corner in the web. But if I have a second row and my thing is 70 pixels tall, then if I do the position of 0, 70, that means it starts down here. Right? Now, knowing those couple things, we can go take a look at some of the animation CSS and start to dive into what they do. Now, the easiest way to do that, because it involves building a whole thing, is to actually go to, where is my, oh, is it over here? Bring up this guy. Go to Moodle, and do I have it there? I do. Let me just turn it on here. if you go refresh Moodle, I have a JS fiddle. Anyone played with fiddles before? Fiddle, CodePen, right? There's a bunch of these like tools online that let you play around with certain aspects of your web application without having to build a whole framework and a whole application. And it's really helpful to play here. I'm going to blow this one up so you can see it. Do I need to go that big? Maybe not. Okay. There is no JavaScript here, so that's kind of empty. This fiddle is what I've put out here, and by all means, you can edit it all you want. Okay. Here's where I'm pulling from the internet the actual PNG file that is the top thing, just an image, nothing crazy. And all I've done to make the animated guy is added a div with the right class on it. Okay. There's nothing crazy going on there. When I look at this animation, and boy, this is getting old, but let me just prune this down to what we really need. These are all browser-specific variants for when there's a new feature in CSS that isn't supported by all browsers. Once it's supported by all browsers, the default thing works. So that's the whole thing to make that guy wave. What we do is we create a keyframes function, and we give it a name, and we specify the starting position and the ending position. Now I just have one row in the image, so I only have to change the first element, or the x coordinate, the left side. And what this does is it tries to go from this position to that position, but it doesn't know how long, and that's indicated here. This is going to use the play animation to determine the starting CSS and the ending CSS. It's going to take 0.8 seconds to do so, from here to there. And it's going to do it in 10 discrete steps, and it's going to loop infinitely. That's what all those parameters are there for. So you can come in and you can play with them. If you take the steps out, you can see what happens, right? And if you change this to like 2 seconds and then run it, right? And there we go. So not doing discrete steps, we get to see it scroll. Now, why has it got that burst on the scroll?
Because they don't know how much steps we are going to play in 2 seconds.
Right, so over the 2 seconds, no, it doesn't know how many steps to play it over, but it also doesn't know how to get from here back to here when it loops.
Oh.
So it has to start here, go all the way to here, and then where's the next thing it's got to go? Back to here. So the little burst is the slide back to the beginning.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Oh, from here to here.
So as soon as I put the steps in, it lets it skip all the way. Right. Now I made the wrong number of steps, so you can see that it's moving a little too far. It's basically taking the full length of this and it's dividing it into 8. It's trying to go little bits at a time. Right? Now we just go slow. I think you'll notice his hand gets cut off in one of the frames. It goes a little bit too far, so it's just about knowing how big the div is. So this is a cool little demo to do some animations. You can stash this little piece of knowledge away in the back of your head. If you ever have anything, especially that's doing a repeating thing, this is a far faster, simpler way to do it than to try and write some JavaScript code to do it. Okay. CSS animations are really powerful because anytime you're using transformations or these background elements, they happen on your accelerated hardware. Now I can add another part to this too. I can transform it. The transform CSS allows you to use any number of predefined transformation functions. Really doesn't like spaces in there in CSS. It's just a simple translation. Right? And you can tack multiple together.
What is 100 px?
100 pixels.
Yeah, I know. What is the 100 px of what?
It translates 100 pixels in the X direction. Yeah. Strange things about the web, as much as I think there's a lot of really cool stuff there. All of these features have come in over a period of time, 20, 30 years. So positioning something top left, but translating it XY. Don't ask me why people change the terminology for the coordinate system. It's the same.
Maybe trying to adapt for game engines like Unity and Unreal.
Yeah, it's like which
Yeah.
left-handed or right-handed are
Yeah.
you going to go, right? If I add a rotation in there, why did it not run? What was the mistake I made?
Specify like how many what.
How many watts? Yeah, it doesn't know units.
Yeah.
You can actually use degrees here. And it rotates the whole div, right? Now, extrapolate with your brain. When I showed you the demo of the game, object A hits object B. Well, when object A, the pig, was firing out of the cannon, there was some physics going on to figure out what was supposed to happen, where is it supposed to be. To update what's on the screen, I was then adding a transform to the pig, and I was computing those values and that value every frame, and then updating those values every frame. Okay? When two things collide, well, the two things colliding is a different story. That's a physics problem. But once the physics does its thing, I have to go ask the physics model of the world, where is everything now? And I apply the right transform and rotation to everything on the screen. So when we build our levels, we're just saving divs. X, Y, width, height, here's the class that goes with it, right? When we load it back into the game, we're going to take those obstacles, and we're not only going to create the thing on the screen, but we're also going to have to create a model in the background that we can apply some physics to. So in the game side of things, there's additional work we have to do when we load a level back again. And using these transforms is how we're going to manipulate things while it's running. Again, the transform, as opposed to setting the width and height and the top and the left, right? Like the top left CSS, they get handled by your CPU when the page gets loaded. The transform gets handled by the GPU. Right? Make sense? So You can add translations. They don't mean much if you add the third dimension on the web, right? You do have a third dimension. You have a Z index, and the Z index is out from the page. If you add a second or a third dimension to the rotation, you actually can rotate a div towards you, which has some weird effects, but some spinning kind of fakery is going on. But that's the way you can think of it. Every div is a card, and as soon as you rotate the Z direction, you're actually just rotating the card around its center. The other thing is, where did this rotate around? And this is the part I'm going to come back to again.
Oh, we checked it.
Right? Where did it rotate around? Let's see if I can do this guy. Art. It's art. When I take him and rotate him, I rotate him around the upper left corner because that's the origin in the web.
Yeah.
So he rotates like that. Okay. In your game, this is going to be a pain in the ass. Just like it is in every game engine. Because where do we want to rotate him?
The center.
Around the middle, right? We want him to rotate. But he's not. He's going to rotate around there. So what we really have to do is we have to do the math ourselves when we do the game. That's where I'm going to go over this again, right?
Okay.
When we do the game, we're going to have to do the math ourselves. We're going to translate it, and then we're going to try and rotate it. And how do we rotate it? We translate it back to the origin, plus the offset of half of the width and the height. Then we rotate it. Then we translate it back. Every game engine known to man does this with every rotation it does. Right? So when we do it in the web, you're the programmers. You have to make that happen. There is no magic. I'll throw the asset in Unity by dragging and dropping it and let Unity do the work. However, once you get how that works and it's clear in your head, if you decide to go into Unity and go grab the transform for a particular game object and you want to rotate it, you can call a function to tell it what to rotate it around. And it'll do the, like if you want to tell it to rotate around the center point, it does the translation rotation, translate back in the background for you. Okay, cool. Animated stuff, right? All right, so this is just kind of what the HTML code looks like to do it. If you were to build it yourself, you're going to build a class with an animation style, and you're going to give the name of the animation and the duration. And then there's additional parameters we can add to make it either loop infinitely or run in steps, whatever. Here's the right-left wiggle that I did. I have a right-left anim. That's my animation function. And then I've just broken these out into separate components. The iteration count infinite we get. What's the timing function? Anyone played with some of this animation stuff before? Okay. When I play out an animation, if I have 10 frames of animation over 10 seconds, what do? I play 1 frame per second? That's linear, right? What happens if I want to play the first 5 frames in the first 3 seconds? Then I have to stretch the others over the remaining 7 seconds, right? That's a non-linear animation. The rate of change, the acceleration. And why would I do that? Anyone played a fighting game?
don't like fighting games. I haven't played it.
But when you play a fighting game,
Yeah,
right?
But, the punches are really fast.
When you push the button, you want responsiveness. How do I get responsiveness? I have an animation that's a punch. How do I get it responsive? I play 50% of the animation in the first 30% of the frames. So it accelerates to that point, and then it slows down. Follow through. Now we do that when we do games because we want it to feel responsive. I hit the button, it happened. And then I'm going to do something else. So when we get more sophisticated, we're going to blend one thing to the next. We're going to blend the response with the recovery. And that blend is going to blend with the tail end of the animation. So I don't want the stuff that's most important at the tail end. I want the stuff that's most important at the beginning. So the animator is going to go ahead and make a punch. It's going to be exciting. Or they can do a walk, right? But now we can change around the rate at which we play back the frames of animation. And this exact same functionality is available in the web by adding an animation timing function. These are also known as easing functions. This is the rate at which the animations get played. And these easing functions, there's a bunch of predefined easing functions. So ease in is slow at the beginning, fast at the end. Ease out, fast at the beginning, slow at the end. Ease in, out, slow at the beginning, fast in the middle, slow at the end. So by using one of these predefined easing functions, you can add a little bit of pop to your animation. We can also specify not just from and to, but we can go midpoints as well. And from, you can use 0% if you want. But this is the percentage of the way through the amount of time that the animation plays out over. So in the right-left anim, you'll notice it starts from a translation of nothing, and it ends on a translation of nothing. But in the middle, it goes to 5 pixels to the right and 5 pixels to the left. So it actually goes that way, then back. Right? And voila, you have bouncing things. Like the little star that bounces. Right? You want to make it bounce with physics, you move the div. You want to make the star grow and shrink every time it hits the ground? Just do this stuff.
If you put 30-40% after 60%,
Yeah.
go back.
Yeah, it could. You can use any numbers you want and any number of steps you want. Okay? So fun stuff to play with. Right? Nice, lightweight, good afternoon, right?
Yeah, I have some free time today, but I think it looks good.
So this is kind of the picture of the same thing. You could say, here's a sprite sheet I found online, and there's a billion of these things, okay? Again, for educational purposes, grab something and use it. Don't waste your time making the art. If you're doing something commercial, hire an artist to make the art, okay? You get paid way too much to push pixels around. But this is all we got to think about doing. You just got to get some specs here, right? How wide is each image? And they all need to be identical. And then how many images do I need to make up my animation? Now you see those big sprite sheets that have lots of rows of things? Quite often it's 1 row per character. And now I can use a background position in combination with this. I can use a background position of, say, 0 and then maybe 100 pixels. And then call it whatever character it is. So character A is background position 0, 0. And character B is background position 0, 100. And when I call the keyframe animation, it's only changing the X component, so the Y stays the same. So now I'm using the cascade in the style sheet plus adding the character B plus anim classes to go and get the right character and animate them the right way. And this is how 2D sprite-based animation games used to do it as well. If you're writing your own in C++ or C# because you don't have enough other stuff to do and you want to see how that works, This is how you would put those pieces together. All right. Now I talked briefly about transforms. We know all about vectors, right? And matrices. You all cool with vectors and matrices? You got that far? You're in the math class now, right? Who's teaching the math this term? Amir is?
They've only done vectors so far.
Ah, you get all this stuff, right? So anybody this is brand new to? Andre, did you guys do this in high school? Vectors and lines with physics?
I use vectors for like engine physics and stuff.
I just asked because like my kid did calculus in high school, but not linear algebra, and some of her friends from Ontario did linear algebra, but not calculus. So I don't know which one you were exposed to in high school.
I only saw vectors in like the coding classes, never in math.
Give me the names of your instructors. What are you doing? These people need to know this stuff.
Yeah, they don't teach linear algebra in like the Surrey schools and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's an East Coast thing. Because Ontario and Quebec, I got told that they taught linear algebra in high school, but not calculus. Not derivatives and integrals, and you guys know what the hell I'm talking about. Am I just like,
Yeah, we got everything.
you got it in high school? So we'll talk about this. I'll let Mir go into the details behind this. Every one of these transformations can be represented by a matrix of values. So a bunch of rows and columns of numbers that are really the coefficients. So if you think of a vector as a line in space, you can also represent it, let's just say 2D with an xy, and if you just put the two numbers side by side, you've got a vector, and it's supposed to be from the origin to that particular point. So it gives some directionality as well. And you can just kind of think of them as arrows in space. When we talk about a matrix, we talk about multiple, 2, 3. So typically speaking, we'll have one more dimension than we have coordinates. So a matrix for 2 dimensions would be 3 by 3. And the reason we use a matrix is because of the way the linear algebra works. And when we do the linear algebra, different parts of the matrix affect different things, the transforms. Don't worry, I'm going to give you the pictures. And the best part about it is just like in our game engines, once you kind of get what each transform does, there's a function that does it. You don't have to do the math yourself. You don't have to do the linear algebra yourself. The CSS does it. Okay. The different kind of transformations we typically have are translation and rotation. I showed you scaling. That shouldn't be a big surprise of what that does. And you can scale in the dimensions different. Okay? Skewing. What's skewing?
I don't even know the meaning of the word.
Yeah. Skew?
Yeah, no, I think Google Translator.
Yeah, but you're going to Portuguese, and you're going to, like, no offense, but weird Portuguese.
Hey! Oh, actually, it's never like for 2 weeks that Hugo's from Brazil. He didn't know that. He has no accent. His accent is pretty.
He's been here so long.
Yeah, so he got it. So skew is. Oh.
Okay. So if you take a box and you skew it to the left, you do this.
Ah.
The tops and the bottoms stay parallel, but the left and the right tip over.
Okay.
Okay? The matrix operation lets you do all of it at once. So if you combine all of these things together, but you kind of got to know the way the format of the matrix function works. So it's transform, function. And you can put multiple of them together, and it doesn't matter what order you do them in. As far as the processing goes, it does them in the order it finds them. So if you do rotate, translate, rotate, it'll literally do them in that order. Right? All right. We talked about sprites. We've got some rotations. We've got our animation. Let's go to... Yeah, let's just do this. Let's stop for 10 minutes. And when we come back, I'll give you the little demo of how to do the draggable stuff. And then once we got through some of that, then we'll sit down and open up the editor and actually kind of like put some of the pieces together ourselves, see if we can make it work. Okay?
The problem is also just with drag.
So let's dive into the next piece, which is something you're going to need right away, and see if I can get through the basics of this relatively quickly so we can do it hands-on. Okay. I have a bunch of demo code in this deck, and I don't want you to replicate the demo code. I put the demo code here because it's a really old school way of doing things that very easily highlights all of the things you need to do. When we do our code hands-on, I'm going to show you a slightly more modern way to do it. Essentially, the web and JavaScript realized people weren't wanting to do this a lot, and so they added it into the standard. So it still does the same things I'm going to show you. It's just going to do it in a little bit easier way with some additional events that we're going to hang on to. What we're really going to do if I come back to my little thing here, what we're really going to do is we're going to have some stuff. And that stuff is in an area, and what I want to do is be able to move it, right? And I want it to move so that it can't leave its kind of like designated area. And I can move these things around, okay? And once I do this, I'm going to want to play around with them so that, you know, I can, of course, put something animated in there. There's a little monster flying around. And when we go and play with this stuff, we can actually attach data to something so that we drag it and drop it. We can transfer the data from the thing we're dragging to the thing we're dropping. And that's one of the key and critical pieces that we're going to do, because when I drag from one region of the screen to another, one of the things I'm going to want to do is, hey, what was the thing that was the source div that I want to steal all the properties from? And when I drop it, I'm going to get a new thing. So I'm going to have a reference to the old thing to go steal all the properties in JavaScript. So I'm not going to have that old thing necessarily. I'm going to have an event handler that's going to handle the dropping action. And so I'm going to need to get that information back out again. And let's see if those two can be moved around. You see I'm doing some Z ordering stuff here, so the red one's always in front. And I can play them around. Stop. Stop already. Okay. Take a look here. Okay, so how does that actually work and fit together? Well, you have to detect a bunch of things. So, when is the mouse up and moving around? Where is the mouse? What's the mouse on top of? When do I click down on the left mouse button? And once it's down and I move, I need to keep track of both of those things. That the mouse is still held down and I'm moving the mouse. And then in and out are events that happen to show us that our mouse has gone inside or outside of some div or some element. And the trick to all of this is that all of these events are available in JavaScript. So all we have to do is figure out the right sequencing and the right events to attach the right things to. We're also going to need, because we want to drag and drop stuff, to attach a couple flags to things. So in this particular kind of demo, all of these objects are going to be triggered by us doing certain events. In other words, when I'm over top of something that's draggable from my library, I'm going to flip a flag. And once I flip that flag, as soon as the mouse goes down, I'm going to know which element I landed on top of. The event object is going to tell me where I am on the screen. and it's going to tell me which target I've clicked on, right? From those two things, again, if I'm moving an object, I could click anywhere in here. So what I need to know is, where did I click? Where's the origin of this object? And knowing where I clicked, I want to know the real, how far from the origin of this object did I click, not where on the total screen. There's like 4 different coordinate systems we have to take a look at. And our JavaScript event object has all of them in it every time. So we just have to pull out the right ones. The basic algorithm is kind of the same. I'm going to hover over something, select it, bring it to the top, so change its Z index. I'm also going to want to save the original Z index. Then I'm going to move it. So as long as the mouse is down, it's a flag, and I'm moving, then I'm going to keep track of how far I moved, and I'm going to move the origin a corresponding amount. When I drop it or let go of the mouse button, that's when I'm going to do my special actions. And in our level editor, the special action, if I were to drag the blue cube and drop it somewhere, would be to make a copy of the blue cube. So I want a reference to the blue cube, then I want to create a new div, I want to append the new div to the editor area, and then I want to steal the properties out of the blue cube. Because when I let it go, I don't want 2 of them there, I just want the 1, right? And then I'll deselect it. So if we look through putting these pieces together, software-wise, I would probably want to build a draggable component. A separate standalone object that manages the draggable things. And what do I attach that draggable object to? So I'm going to want to attach it to something inside my editor or inside my library area. So in this case, I'm going to pass that DOM element in. Okay? So I'm going to create this draggable handler. This object is there to help me manage these draggables. Now again, this is a level lower than we're going to go, but it'll help you get what's going on here. I'm going to attach an element, and I'm going to show you a new way. As of this year, JavaScript introduced private properties and methods. If you're disciplined, it doesn't make any difference in the world. If you're not, it'll prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. Maybe, sometimes, possibly. The way we used to do it is we would create a variable or property, and this one is local. I often would create one called this._private_. Because 99% of all programmers will read that and go, if you looked at it in the debugger and you saw something that said $_private $_, you'd A, assume JavaScript did that, not me, and B, it says private, right? So you'd probably not modify the properties in there. So just by convention. But I'll show you how the new JavaScript private things work, because it's kind of nifty. Anyways, I'm going to grab a hold of the DOM element I want to drag around, and I'm going to save it in my constructor here. And the other thing is, in the constructor, I'm going to add some stuff here to initialize a whole bunch of event handlers. Okay? Now I'm going to do it in a little bit slicker way in this particular one. I'm going to create a bunch of methods, but I'm just going to create them by name. So I've got a couple flags, right? Is the mouse up or down? Is it over top of something that's draggable? And then these offsets, you know, I want to keep track of when I click here, well, I'm not lifting the mouse up while I move it, right? So the offset from the left and the top are going to be consistent as long as I'm moving it. So I might as well save those, right? And then my original Z index because I'm going to reset it and bring it to the front. Okay. So now I've got some properties stashed there. I'm going to hook up the methods to take care of all of these event handlers. Now, I probably wouldn't write the same way these days, but this is kind of what we're going to do. And it's squished because it's on the projector. These would all be one line. But when the mouse over happens, I want to call my over method. So I don't want it all buried in the constructors, one big long monolithic thing to debug. I'm going to create a method for each thing, and I'm just going to hook them up this way. I've got a quick reference chart. So mouse down, mouse move, mouse up, mouse out, those are actual events that you can attach event handlers to. And I'm using jQuery here to make it a little easier. All right, the mouse over event, I'm going to go grab the thing I'm moving. If it has the class draggable, and this is how I'm going to identify things, is I'm going to use the HTML to add classes to things. One of the classes I'm going to add doesn't have any styling in it. But because it's a class and I can call jQuery's hasClass method, it'll tell me very quickly whether the object I've grabbed has this class or not. If it has this class, I've already identified it as something I can drag and drop. If it doesn't have this class, I can't. So here's where I trick for that. I also changed the cursor. Again, CSS has a nice way to change CSS all at once. And I'm going to undo those things if I don't succeed, like if I don't have that draggable class. Now, this I would rewrite differently these days. I would put these two things at the top and eliminate the whole else clause. Any interpreter or compiler out there, remember we did the assembly code thing? It turns this into if draggable has class, call function returns true or false. This, it turns into another if statement. So it goes and does the negative of that. So I'm calling the if statement twice. It's kind of just bad habit. The out method really kind of does this. So if you're not over top of something. So that's not really rocket science. When I click the mouse down, now I'm ready to move things. So I flag it, and then I go find where my offset is from the thing I'm moving. And this is where it gets a little confusing. I'm going to go here and grab the offsets from the window. So I got to know where have I clicked, where's that origin relative to the editor that I'm going to place it in. Remember, it might be down here right now. Okay. The other thing is I'm going to take the math.floor of those. That turns them into integers. When I retrieve these values, they may be strings. Or they may be string something something px. And I just want the numbers because I want to do some math with the numbers to subtract offsets from widths and heights. So I'm going to use this function rather than parse int, which is another function that does this kind of thing. And that's only because I started digging around some of the performance metrics, and it turns out that the math library runs about 10 times faster than the parse int method. So if you're doing parse int, which is a stock JavaScript method all over the place, it's quite a bit slower. The same is also true if you do get element by ID or get element by class or get element by type, as opposed to query selector. So it looks like somebody has spent time optimizing some of those things. Anyways, I'm also going to grab the z index and save it, and then I'm going to reset the z index to bring it to the front. And when it's time to move, then I'm just going to check all the flags I've previously set, and if they're all set, then I'm going to change its position. And the magic here is really just in the math. And you got to remember that when you're setting the CSS, you're setting text. So we've got to set it up. I've used the backticks here, and you got to make sure to put the pixels in. So I'm doing the math as I go. Now this happens with every move event, and the move event happens every time you move the mouse, so it's happening a lot. But the net effect, because we're updating the CSS all the time, is, well, the thing moves when I move the mouse. Okay. And then finally, when I release the mouse, you know, if I've got something selected, draggable's not null, then I want to return the cursor, return the Z index, and leave it where I moved it to. Okay. Now there's a couple other caveats if you want to make a copy of something. You want to know when you dropped it on something. So this is the basic algorithm that's going on behind the scenes. Now people are doing this a lot, and you notice I'm tying into the mouse methods all the time. And there's 6 of them that I have to handle. So what the JavaScript ECMA W3 consortium did is said, well, let's just build it into the language. So they created 3 new events for the things we're dragging around. Drag start, drag end, and drag. Drag start, I clicked on it and I'm starting to move. Drag, I'm actually in the process of moving it. Drag end, I let it go. And then for the target thing, there's a drop event, a handler for the drop event. Now the trick to making that work is that whole internal data transfer. Because the thing I'm dragging around, it doesn't get an event that says I dropped it, it just drag end. The thing that I dropped it onto, my editor window, I get the drop event, but I don't get the drag start, drag beginning, because I don't know what I'm dragging. So the drop event happens, what we want to do is from the event object find out, what did you drop on me? And once I find out what you dropped on me, I can use jQuery to go retrieve it, grab its width, its height, its classes, create a new div, put all those components together. Kind of makes sense in theory?
Yeah.
Okay. Ready to do it in practice?
Wow, that's a difference.
Watch me break it. No. So this is one of the things that we're going to need for our editor. So if you think about all the different components for that editor, okay, and I close this guy up and we go back to our code here, just dive that down. So for our editor, what do we need? We need an area that's going to have all our pre-built objects that we can use. Okay, so if we follow through kind of the timing diagram way, when we create the editor, the constructor for the editor is going to make a request to the server right away. Go give me the list of all the levels. Go get me all of the things in the library of objects I can use. In one form, it's going to list the selection list of all the levels it found. Probably going to select one of them and make a request out to the server, second request to the server, third request to the server, to go and fetch that level. While it's dealing with that, it's also made a request for all of the library objects, and for each library object, it's going to sit in a loop and it's going to ask each library object for its data. Okay. For each library object, you're going to create a div in that library area, and you're going to have to create some sort of JavaScript object to model it, because not all the parameters are in the DOM, right? Bounciness has nothing to do with what you see on the screen. So that stuff doesn't get kept in the HTML. So we're going to need an object to create that. So I created an object called a prefab, and I stuffed that stuff in there. Once I have those two things, my level is now loaded, has nothing in it. Right? Now, I want to be able to go here and drag something and drop it into the editor. And when I drag it and drop it, I want the editor area to handle the drop event, and I want the drag portion for the library object to handle when I start dragging something, go grab the information I need from the thing I'm dragging, stuff it in that memory space that I'm going to transfer to the thing I'm dropping it on. When I drop it, I transfer the data. The drop area then asks it, hey, what are you, how big are you, what class are you using? Let me create a new thing. Let me add those properties. Let me make a reference to the model that you're using, right? So that I can fill in the form. And I'm done. Okay? Now if I want to make this box drop to the floor, as Arsene was asking, that's a little bit more work. You can either do it with physics. Once you've done the game, you can go back here and add physics to those things. That's probably the easiest way to do it. The other way would be to simply figure out how far above the floor you are, subtract that from the top, and it would drop to the floor. And then you have to do a special case. If you have this, now when this guy tries to figure out how far it is to the floor, it has to take this edge and every place in between to see if there's something underneath. Well, you don't have to check every place in between. You can check this edge and this edge. Is this box outside? So this is what we call a bounding box test. Think of the box under here as the bounding box you want to test. Is every other object in the editor to the left of my bounding box? If it is, great, I can just drop this down. If every other box in the editor is to the right of my box, great, I can drop it down. Otherwise, I need to figure out the height of the tallest box that's in between the left and the right, and I can only drop this enough to land on top of that box. Or you could just set them up like this in the editor and know that when you get into the game and you add the physics and they fall, they'll land correctly. So, your call. More math, less math. You're going to do more math, aren't you?
Maybe I'll just draw on the screen and let the physics let it fall somewhere, and then I'll say that's what I meant.
I've never had anybody make physics in the editor. Even by the end, like once you're familiar with how to do it, that doesn't mean it's a bad solution. It just, most people look at it and go, that seems like extra stuff, right? So it's just gonna kind of work. All right. So I'm going to do a little bit of this on the client side to show you the drag and drop part in a nice modern way. I'm going to share it here. Let me copy the link to Discord. All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of that, and then we'll start looking at some of the issues or problems. So on the server, making sure your server you can talk to. The hardest part we're also gonna deal with is, so I'm transferring some data from the client to the server or back, and how do I make sure I translate it from strings to objects and objects to strings nicely? And also on the server, you figured out how to write files? right? Has everyone tried writing a file from the server? So we'll try and do a little bit of that. Okay. I'm going to close that up because I don't need it for right now. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this fancy, this is the server we wrote the other day. And the first thing I'm going to show you is the fancy new syntax for private methods. Are you ready for it? It's fancy. That's it. Now, respond to client is considered private. And only methods inside that server class can call it. And you call it exactly the same way you think you would. Respond to client. How's that? You feel much more knowledgeable now? This is brand new. Brand new this year. Now, technically speaking, you can also make private variables by doing this, which is the first time you can edit anything outside of a method. And now I can refer to this as hashtag API. And that API is now private. Amazing, right? That's what I thought too. Now, by convention, people in C# do this with an underscore. I'm not sure if it's really all that helpful, but time will tell. All right, next thing I'm going to do, we're going to start looking at the client side of things. I'm going to put my server to the side here. And don't be surprised. I often kind of, I don't know about you guys, but I rearrange the files order in the tabs for the way that they work. I start with the server. When I ask the server for a specific folder, like the root folder for the index file, then I'm going to put the index file next. I'll put the CSS beside it. Don't really need it right now. So that's the first thing I get. And then after that, I get an index.js application I run. Not real crazy as we go. All right. So, let's create some stuff. So first things first, inside here, in our editor, where's my editor? Okay, so the editor's here. I've got that form that I put in. Look at that big form thing. Let's just disable that for now. I want to be able to get to the actual editor in there, right? That's where I'm actually going to create my level. And before I create my level, I'm going to put some test data in there. There's my test box. So the magic here is HTML added this draggable component. When you add that draggable component, it enables all of the drag and drops events on that div. All the default automatic things. So the only thing we have to do is override the events we want to trap at this point. So anything you want draggable, you can add the draggable attribute to. It's effectively doing this, right? Which also means you can set draggable equals false to make something not draggable again. Now, when I'm going to drag something, I need a thing to drag. So I want to create something to manage this. And that thing I'm going to create in my editor, I'm going to create a new file called a prefab. Now, if you want to do it with the game object, that's fine. Like, that's just terminology and syntax. You can call it whatever you like.
Are you doing the same thing? Oh.
I usually differentiate the two. Okay. I'll use this kind of convention too. Let's shorten this up. Okay. So this is the guy taken right from the sample data. So I have all the right property names. Okay, just remove the quotes from the property names, and that's the data we got to save. You notice I'm putting it in a private variable. Okay, let me simplify this last bit a little bit. I don't really want just the source data. I want everything that's currently in my private data plus my source data, and I do that with that spread operator. And get rid of the curly brackets here. You guys all clear on what this does?
I forgot. Can you explain it again, please?
So the spread operator, right, spreads out all of the properties that are inside whatever thing you gave it. So this has a collection of properties.
Yeah.
This curly bracket creates a new object.
Yeah.
This new object now contains all of the properties that this object has. So we're making a copy of this guy. And then it has all the properties this guy has. Well, if this guy has the same properties,
This is going to change to.
it will overwrite the ones that this guy put in. That's why I put them in this order.
Okay, got it.
Okay?
So get all the information inside that object.
Right.
Okay, got it.
So the net effect of this one line is to make a copy of the private data plus the source data, merge them together. Any properties in here that have the same name as a property in here, this one overwrites that one. And what I'm left behind with is I guarantee to have all of these properties. I may have more, but I guarantee to have all of these properties. And there'll be whatever value was in source data. And if source data didn't have one, I have a default here.
Okay, that's good.
right? Cool, one line. Do the one line object copy in C#.
Yeah, you can.
You can't. It doesn't exist. You have to write a copy method. Because when you say one object equals another, it's a pointer. It's just a reference.
Okay.
I always love throwing that one at the C# guys. Go ahead. Write your C#. Make sure all the types line up and match. I already did. All my types line up and match. But wait, there's more. I'm a lazy programmer. And while this showing up in the debugger is clear to any programmer looking at it what it is, private stuff hands off, I don't want to type that all over the place. That's okay, I got it covered. I just need a reference to it. Cool. A lot less stuff to type, right? And if I want to get to it, like down here, cool, just overwrite it. Now if I have another method in here, you remember writing accessors? So you won't get confused, right? You ever seen people use that M underscore in front of a variable? It's a member variable. But I just kind of extended it to this is my data, my mass. Like it just reads really easy, right? And when you come back to it 6 months from now, I don't have to write a lot of comments in here. I'm going to access my private data, and then I'm going to take my private mass and set it to this new mass. Right? So just little tricks because you can use them. I'm going to rewrite this. C# has getters and setters. C++ has getters and setters. JavaScript might as well join the party, right? So the syntax for get properties in JavaScript is to just return something, no parameters. And for set, you give it a single parameter always. And then you can do whatever you want with that single parameter, but you don't return anything. This makes mass a public property. So when I create this game object, I can ask for GameObject.mass, and it will retrieve this, whatever this function does. Okay, so if you're using private stuff, the world doesn't have to see this. You can just expose what you want. That new private mechanism supersedes this. So if you want, you could make this private a private variable. And you have to do it by declaring it here. And then, of course, you have to put the number sign in all over the place, which is going to really throw people because it looks funky. So, two different ways to do that. Don't really care which one you choose. If something doesn't need to be hidden from the world, don't hide it from the world. Most of the time, most JavaScript you see from most developers in a commercial kind of setting don't use private anything. They just chuck the attributes in there and like, don't use this. Or maybe there's a comment to that effect. Okay. So there's all sorts of different things you'll see out there, as long as the convention's the same on your team. Now, why did I go into this game object or create a new prefab? I created a prefab so I could differentiate between something that I'm using in the editor and something that I'm going to attach some physics to eventually. So in this case, and just to make it a little bit easier for me, I'm just going to clone this. And what I suggest you do when you get to building the game part, if you follow this methodology, is that game object takes a prefab and doesn't have this. So it's not an inheritance thing, it's an uses a thing, has a. So game object has a prefab that it came from. Does that make sense? Right? You were to draw the diagram thing. It's another one of those cases where I'm just turning around and skipping a few steps. And then I would update my game object. Just to be consistent, I'm going to make sure I do all this. This isn't this dot private dot mess, it's prefab. Right? Don't need this anymore, really. And now my getters and setters are percolated up. And populate, I'm going to just call my I'll just make that really simple. And now here, it might make sense to make that private. If you want to play with that stuff. Now, yes, you can do this with inheritance. But part of the reason I did this was to illustrate that almost anything you can do with inheritance, you can also do with aggregation. You don't need to inherit things. go back to this guy. Here's our little guy here. And one of the things we're going to have to do here is figure out, you know, what are we going to do when we make it draggable. Right? So I'm going to need some access to some of the pieces. Let me just do it all. I got this guy to use. Make draggable, and then I think I'm also going to do the drop event handler, right? First thing, that's when it loads. There we go. That's our little form test, right? Let me pull this form test out into a separate method because I don't want this constructor to get too huge. Call it level save. Okay, so this is how I'm keeping things nice and easy. So the on drop, I'm going to go grab my editor area. And the event I want to tie into Now I might want to do a bunch of different things. So the total events that I want to play with, I'm going to attach them all here at once by chaining them together. Okay. I'm going to take that editor area. I'm going to do a bunch of things. Just going to use a dummy here. No capitals there. And so those are the new modern events that we want to tie into. Okay, so I'm going to have to do some stuff on the prefab as well, because I want to figure out when it starts to drag. I want to grab some information from it. But in this particular case, I'm always going to, I usually do it kind of this way as a template. I'll cut and paste this from another app, and then I'll fill in the blanks. On drag enter, I'm not really going to do anything. The other thing I'd note here is this is pretty much the only place we use the fat arrows. Okay, the fat arrows always inherit the context that they were written in. The only reason we use the fat arrows is so that this actually points to the right thing. So anywhere outside of an object's callback function, using a fat arrow is not helpful. It's not adding the context that we need. Right? They will work in places that that's not the appropriate use for them. Anyways, when I drag enter, there's nothing I really want to do there. The drag over, really, remember I had that piece of code that turned the cursor from a crosshair back to the normal pointer arrow? That would be the appropriate place to do that. So in here, nothing. In here, I'm going to go in and I'm going to go prevent the default thing, and then I'm going to just really, if I have any things in the world, so a couple other things as I write this, I recognize that I'm using CSS classes to identify certain things as a group. So I use the CSS class obstacle as a class that doesn't necessarily have a lot of CSS styles in it, but every obstacle that I can move has got the obstacle class in it, so I can do stuff like this, grab them all at once, and make sure that I've got the right cursor here. You can set it to the default cursor if you want. I use the draggable property to determine whether something's draggable or not. And then I actually have a class I use called placed. So when I grab something out of my library, I drag it. When I drop it, I'm going to go, hey, did I drag this thing from the library or did I drag it from an existing position on screen? If I dragged it from the library, that means I'm going to create a new div. I'm going to create a copy of it. And when I create that copy, I'm going to add the class placed. Because the next time I grab this exact same div, it's still going to be draggable, but I don't want to make another copy of it. So if it has the class placed on it, I'm just going to move it. I'm not going to make a copy of it. So that's where our draggable on drop event here is going to have to do some work. So we're going to do that on the edit zone. So what do we got to do when we drop it? We're going to use that edit zone, right? What was dragged here? So we're going to get a jQuery object. Let's do that. Just to push things up a little bit. So we need to know what was dragged there. What do we need to do with it?
It's for the library, instantiate a new object.
Right. So if it doesn't have the class placed, create a new one, right? And then shouldn't say move. Because it might be something that was already there. So I just want to like fix that. I'm also going to have to do something here. I'm going to have to like figure out, you know, so one of the things that's always a little tricky is up here when I grab all obstacle objects and switch their cursor, if I then create a new obstacle, that obstacle doesn't have this CSS. This selector runs at a specific time and grabs all the things with that class name. Well, I'm dynamically adding new ones. So if I'm going to add some events to all obstacles to allow them to make them draggable, I'm going to have to do it up here. I'm going to have to also do it every time I add a new one to make sure the new one I added has those event handlers on it as well. If I've got 3 boxes in the editor and I add a 4th, well, if the 3 boxes can handle being dragged around, they have event handlers attached to each of them. When I create the 4th, it doesn't have anything on it. It's brand new. So it doesn't have any event handlers, doesn't have any classes. I have to add all those things. And one of the ones we always find people forget to do is add those event handlers. So we'll do that as well. Right. So that's the nuts and bolts. Now in order to do that, I'm going to need to use that edit zone, and I'm going to say, you know what? I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it yet. I know it's in the event object, I can tell you that much. So I'm going to extract that draggable data. And then inside that draggable data, I'm expecting there to be the ID of the prefab that I've dragged. So I want to go grab that, and I want to grab it as a jQuery object. Probably should make these const. And I do that the same way I would with any other jQuery. You know, I put an ID in there, and it goes and grabs that thing and creates a jQuery object from it. Except in this case, data. So I'll go grab its ID. Okay. So that's the what did we grab. And this is the place where we might use some of those private methods. I don't know whether I'm going to get used to that or not. Okay. Okay, here's some magic. can't explain why it's buried so far under here, but this is where it's put. So the data transfer object that's buried in the event comes from the draggable thing. So we're going to write some code to set that draggable data. And it's always set as a string. Attribute value pairs. You start to hear this over and over again. So they have a method that tells you how to get it, and you have to tell it what format the data is in. That get data method takes the string that was handed from the thing that was dragged to the drop zone and turns it back into an object. Convoluted. Actually, does it turn it into an object? It doesn't. I am wrong. It just grabs the string. We'll return it. How do we make the draggable thing have that data in it? I'm going to have to do a bunch of them. So as we load the library in the constructor, we're going to get a bunch of stuff, right? So that's the demo form. At some point here, we're going to be like, load the library prefabs. We're going to get a list. And each of those prefab things is going to have, what, some representation on the screen. So I might put that inside of the prefab. I can make it null or undefined. The jQuery object I'm going to store there. That's the view of my thing. The prefab is what controls it or manages it. The view is the DOM element. Okay. Now I need to know that because back here I want to go through that prefab list, right? create my load prefabs, which isn't going to do anything right away. I'm just throwing it in there just so it does something. It's got to return a list. Again, I'm just doing dummy code. Could be that simple. Okay. So I load those prefabs. I have a list of prefabs. Every prefab has a view. So more than likely when I load them, I'm going to create the views for them, put them in the library box. Because what I'm going to have to do next is take that prefab list, and for every element in the prefab list, what am I going to do? I'm going to make draggable. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. Again, callback function. And I just try and do this out of convention. Every time I've got a jQuery object, I typically use that $sign to name it. Just so that visually my eye says, oh yeah, that's a jQuery object. Now, I can do that in the constructor, or I can do that where I load the prefabs. It doesn't really matter. When I'm making it draggable, I've got to do a bunch of things. The first one is, when I start dragging it, I want to grab some information from it. So I'm going to create a JavaScript object. And inside this object, I can put anything I want. Anything. As big or small as I want. If I want to put in maybe my, offset, like the difference from where I clicked to where the top left corner is. Got to spell right. And I said I wanted the ID, so I should probably put that in there. How do I get the ID?
From the draggable thing?
That's the actual element. I can grab its ID attribute. Right? And I want that ID as something I can use in jQuery. I need to put the number sign in front of it, right? Because I'm just grabbing the raw attribute. So I can use the backticks to format that as a nice string. So now it's a hashtag ID like jQuery wants. Do I want anything else out of there? Do I care? Like if I have the ID, I can get everything else, right? Other than that offset from where you first clicked it. And then I need to do something with that data. So I need to attach it. Data transfer object. Set data. In the right format. And what do we want? We want some data string. And what's some data string? That's all it takes to add that data. All right. Now, this is also a good place when you start dragging something. If you want to do anything fancy with it, you want to put a box around it so that you know which thing you've selected. That's where you do it. You want to make it partially transparent, right? Change the opacity property in CSS there. That's where you fix those things, okay? I'll undo those styling changes when drag ends. Right? So this is where you're doing some user feedback. I'm just going to do something in the style to let me know that's the thing I'm dragging, and I'm going to undo it when I end dragging it. And what do I do in the middle while I'm dragging it?
We're going to update our CSS.
Yeah. Okay. I don't actually have to change the actual thing I'm dragging. But if you remember in the one I had running, the demo I had running, it had like the screen coordinates at the bottom. This is where I was updating the screen coordinates. As I was dragging it, I was writing to the HTML box at the bottom, and I was just replacing the inner HTML with a string that said the mouse is currently at this X, this Y. So that was just a string. So anything extra, great place for debug information. Okay. So I call make draggable on everything that has the draggable property that I want to attach these events to, and make sure that I deal with them appropriately. And when I drop them, then I'm going to go extract that draggable data, turn it from a string back into something I can use, and return it to me. Where I can then use it to go grab the ID so that I can grab this jQuery object so I can now work on it. Stuff in the right spot. So I'm going to have to create a new one. So to create a new one, it's not too hard with jQuery. And again, I'm using jQuery because it's saving me time. I'm going to say, look, there's the thing I was dragging around, right? So it's either something that's already in the scene or it's something out of the library. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. If I operate on this, on drop, I can update its CSS properties. Right. I'm going to grab its what? Height. Width. I probably need the class list. I'm gonna go look that up in jQuery. But I need to copy the classes across. So that's where I copy everything. Now here, I'm just gonna update some things based on the thing I dragged around. In here, I'm gonna create a whole new $object using jQuery. And the easiest way is I just put the raw HTML here. Whatever ID number I want to give it. I know it needs to have, I don't want that quote, I want that quote. I know it's going to be an obstacle. I know it's going to be placed. What else do I need to add to that? Let's just keep a counter. The single backtick quotes aren't matched. That's what that is. Just throw a counter in there. Now, that creates a new jQuery object. That jQuery object is a div. I really didn't do a very good job of that. Right? So that's these fancy backticks. That just enables me to put quotes inside and parameterize the string. So yeah, if you put any HTML inside the jQuery selector, it will create a jQuery object using that HTML. It's not attached to the DOM yet. It's just a standalone thing. So I need to attach it to the DOM. And what was my edit window called?
What's the manual editor?
Editor
No,
area.
editor.
So I can just come down here and just attach it. Literally just add it to the end.
That's straightforward.
That's not that hard, right? Brand new div created,
Oh,
right? And it still doesn't have all the properties.
yeah, we need to do the object classes.
Yeah. And then I need to do the make draggable thing with it. And the last thing I need to set its current position. jQuery has a nice little offset. Drag info, drag data.
You didn't find that.
You know those offsets I saved? Now, if you just want to test it out, one of the things you could do here is just don't need quotes on that one. Is it height? Every object that's draggable has to have the draggable property in the HTML. Right? Everything that has the draggable property, we need to attach the drag start, drag end events to, even if they do nothing. And in most cases, we're going to prevent the default things, especially when we do drag start. Now you can experiment with what removing the default thing does or doesn't do. The draggable thing has some default behavior, and a lot of the default behavior is, things like, I think it goes 50% opaque, and you can drag it over something. If you let go of it, it just goes right back to where it was. Right? It doesn't keep track. The other thing is the event object that all of these events will have page XY, client XY, offset XY, all these different XY coordinates, which are really top left coordinates. Yeah, it's a consistency thing. Okay. And each of those refer to a coordinate relative to something. So there's a screen XY as well. So you can find out where is the mouse on the screen, where is it relative to the page, where is it relative to the container that it's in, where is it, right? So we normally use the client and the offset. But one of the things you might want to do is add to this, when we're moving things around, on drag, if you're not sure, format out some strings for screen, client, page, offset, and write them into a div somewhere on the screen. So you're not trying to rely on the debugger or consoles, it's just like right there in front of you on the screen. Debugging this stuff will be a little bit tricky because in order to trap the events, you need to get to the part where the event occurs, and normally the breakpoints typically prevent you from dragging and dropping because you're moving the mouse over to the debugger. So that's a little bit tricky. So put the breakpoints inside the events, and if you don't get the breakpoints you're expecting to get, then you're probably not getting the event triggered on the right thing. Right? So start looking at why is this thing not getting the event I think it should be getting. The whole chunk of it really comes down to those three events on the thing that's being moved, and then the on drop is only on the one event. Where's these four events on the thing that's the drop zone. Right? If you're not doing anything, you don't actually have to write any code for it. I put them in for completeness, so you can see all of the events, but obviously I'm not using drag leave and I'm not using drag enter. Normally you wouldn't see that in the code. People would just drop those and they would let the default thing happen. When I drag over, it's only because I want to make the cursor do something. This prevent default is the one that you need. Otherwise, it'll snap back to where it goes. All right. Lot to take in, lot to try. Okay. We'll take a little, like, 5 minutes stretch,
I think it's a good idea.
and when we come back, we'll deal with some of the problems or issues you have. I might get you guys to just share your screens, and then I can put it up here, and we can edit away. So when we start talking about diving through this, you may have to flip through all the functions there to see what they do. That's kind of normal when you're learning a library of stuff. In fact, I think the most common misconception when people start doing any large amount of programming is that learning the language is the hard part. Learning the language should take you a week to 2 weeks. You gotta learn the keywords, you gotta learn the syntax, where the semicolons and the curly brackets go. Learning the libraries can take years. And so that's where, again, more screen real estate good, because you just have the manual up beside you so you don't have to memorize things. Right? I do all the time. I don't write software without the manual up beside me. There's certain things, yes, that you do every day, all day, and so after a while you just memorize some of them. But for the most part, all of us have. Right? I grew up before the internet. We would have like 6 of these open on our desk at once. Right? You get really good at looking at table of contents and index. And when you don't know what the name of the function is that you're looking for, but you know you want a function that does something that's kind of like, that's a little more frustrating. Right? Or if the manual is written by Microsoft, and it says, turn to page 172, and page 172 says, turn to page 62, so you go to 62, and 62 says, see page 172. You're like, thanks guys, appreciate that. We can do that game. It's too easy though. It's like 90% content, 10% code. Right? No, we'll give you something with a challenge to it. I want you to be challenged.
That's why when yesterday they were talking about your project and Hugo was like, I think I'm a little too soft to you guys. I need to be hard. No.
Yeah. All right, so reading and writing files, you can communicate back and forth to the server. Most of the rest of it's UI work. Try and get the drag and drop thing running. Look in the, do I have the rubric there? Let me look.
When does it do the level editor?
End of March. 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Oh god.
So like,
I thought it was one, and I was kind of desperate.
No. I thought it's the next week.
All right, so, ooh, that's an old rubric. PHP server. You better change that.
So what we're going to
Hang
do
on.
next week?
We're gonna start into the physics.
Oh, so this is when the game starts.
It's not a level gym. Like,
Yes.
it's not about the level.
Almost finished.
Hmm?
It's not about the level editor.
The first assignment is just the level editor.
Yeah.
Next week, no. I'll start talking about stuff in the game next week.
So we covered everything.
You have everything you need to know to build the level editor.
Except
Don't wait to the last minute. For God's sake, do not wait to the last minute.
except
Except
the
for
brains.
except for brains? You have lots of brains. Jeff told me the other day that you guys plowed through his stuff way too fast. So
Because
I told
he's
him
just
add.
showing us, and
I-
we're just doing what he does.
I told him, yeah, well that's, I told him he just needs to put more stuff in there. Do more stuff. I said those PG guys are smart. Just do more stuff faster. Right?
Faster and without like getting interrupted. Nope.
All right.
I don't know this one. Nope.
We're good for today. I'll hang around for a little while if you need some help with stuff.
I know some will want to get
package of JSON, I need to have
Git.
I need to have
Okay.
authorization.
Let me just turn this off.
Why do I get the promise?
I'll see you next week, Scott.
Hey, Jim.
Oh, next one here?
I think you have a dash.
Nathan, look, check over here.
What do you get?
Like this is what I so
Yeah.
if I do this,
Pretty sure, yeah.
it's going to
Advanced dash dash. Or advanced.
or I crash.
Oh.
Yeah, I crashed the word.
Outlander. Oh, it's present side. Oh.
Broken.
Probably, yeah.
It's fine. Oh. It's working? You read the word for a second. Okay, so if I go down to server, now you can do that. What's the name of it?
We'll talk about promises next week.
Right. Right. This one.
Okay. Cool. So, throw some data in, dummy chunk, whatever.
Oh, we need to add that.
Yep.
Right.
So like if you do this or something.
Yep. Perfect.
It's gonna
That's
change.
exactly
It's
right.
gonna write a file called in your root directory, check specific.
Yep.
So it's gonna put this object.
It works.
In this case, just the object just
What
one
about
thing,
these?
name and
I'm
sector.
not trying to load levels.
But you
For
can-
example,
Yeah.
now
Oh, okay.
I'm not trying to level titles.
Okay,
I'm trying to level a specific level. So
Right.
First,
So
first,
two steps, right?
You have to
First one is you're gonna get the list of
require the
level names.
access on the top.
no, I don't care about that.
Okay.
I know that I need to add. So
Okay.
all the level names is just all the file names.
Yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get this level one. So
Right.
I have this.
So that post request? How can I go
Yeah,
that
no.
post? Yeah. So you use a post even though you're getting stuff, just because of the security side of it, right? But all of the post and get methods all need a main clause. It needs to have a .NET afterwards. Yeah. All of them.
But this works without.
Oh.
It will, but it'll create a problem. So what do you do when it comes back? Even if
I'm
it's your
trying.
console
I'm
log.
getting this
Let's
Yeah.
file. I'm making
folder
this
called data.
an object, and I'm getting data from the object and putting it in
Oh yeah, I think that's organization stuff.
So
Make folders of folders. Folder has one file.
Then
Data.
this one.
Are you one folder up?
Yeah, no, then is a method.
No, I'm not. That's
Why is it not keyword?
slash data. Period slash data. Oh,
It's not-
oh yeah, not make the absolute yet. And it was
The
the first
first
bracket
bracket.
mistakes.
You can go period slash or just
Yeah.
get rid of the.
And inside there you put a fat arrow function.
E.
Like that.
Yeah, I mean it's not an
What's the
event,
name of the
but
file?
whatever data you send back
I
from
want
the
to do
server.
object based on my.
Yeah, just give it a name because it needs somewhere to write it to. Period
So
slash
yeah,
double
curly
period
brackets.
statement. Just give it
So
a
it's double?
cat's name for now.
Yeah.
That's .json. Oh,
No, it's just a normal parentheses,
So that's
a normal bracket, like a function call.
and all the information, for example, data.
That is a function. Yep.
So if you're giving it an object,
Just like
this
post is a
not
function,
the
then
import,
is a
he's
function.
making an object right
Yeah.
here. But if data is already an object, just give it
You
data.
get the wrong
Oh,
brackets.
because that's data.
No, you're giving it an object with
After
data
that.
inside. Just give it, just put data.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
See what I mean?
It's
He's-
creating a new
Yeah,
one.
he's
Okay.
defining an object.
So whenever
now I got it.
When you
you
already have
call
an object,
the
so
post
it's gonna work.
to load, it sends the load event here. Right.
Is it?
I'm just trying
Oh,
to
it's
get-
not running anymore.
File system.
Right. So make this a post as well.
So good.
API.post. Maybe I'll show you the router next time as well. It's really just a housekeeping thing.
Do we have only 4?
I'm just asking.
I know, that's what I mean. It's kind of like
The other
that's
method
why I
of
do.
importing, like const,
Don't throw too much at once.
require, blah, blah. It's a common data thing. But
It's fine.
I did
So,
have a common data module.
this
will
data,
be imported just with the import.
in order for this to
Let me just
finish,
ask, like, if you
you
wanna try
always
this
have
real
to
quick,
send something
instead of
back.
change it from import to require.
Oh, that's a compliment.
Response?
Because
Yeah.
So what about
Res.send.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for
Yeah, and then whatever string you want to send back.
But try the const fs.
It's the same as you
Well,
want.
yeah, it's a-
Go as
And that data is E.
Oh,
yeah,
so
what's
it's
the-
Right. And then inside there, whatever you
Whatever,
just
just, just comment down.
Yeah.
If you do control and this, it's like.
Cool.
No, it's inbox.
Okay, then let me. Scott, one quick question. What do we do with FS6 rest on it because it's a common JS? Doesn't support the import logic, the import. But then when we switch it to the just regular const equal blah blah, then it tells me, oh,
No,
you're using
yeah,
modules.
you can't mix them. Fs.extra uses import. Anything that uses type modules.
That's how we had it here. I'll come down here. Yeah, so it's take this part off. Just import the whole X.
Not this part
Yeah,
here?
yeah, just I'll put it on my. Let's see.
Yeah, not nice.
It's just that little bit. That's weird though. Why is
It
that?
has to do with what the package is exporting.
Okay. So you won't let you just import that one
You can't,
function.
you can't cherry pick off anything you want. You can only import what the package exported.
Yeah.
Do they get you what you need?
No.
Okay, so when I you also have a concept there, right?
Yeah, I have it.
What did you
So
have?
bring up in the debugger. You still have it running? So
Console?
bring up the inspector on this.
No.
That's the client.
Run the event.
Okay. Pop that out. And you have the debugger on the server.
Likewise, I was testing that.
This one.
Yeah. So sources. Yeah. Open that up. Yeah. Yep. Got it.
Oh, but it was great.
Now put the breakpoint inside this guy.
Okay, so I have this object forever now. Okay.
Yeah, because that's where you call it load levels, right?
Yeah.
Not in VS Code.
Not forever, but
Nothing is forever, my dude.
Okay, now I gotta how to create all of those ones, like my base options.
Go
And
there.
I didn't have to, when I launch the game, to a load, to get them to the list of the arrays, to add
Oh,
them
where-
to
where-
draggables,
yeah.
to then create the visual
Oh, right here,
representation
yeah.
of them on the level.
Put it inside there.
Yeah,
So
the
I
one
can-
thing you might think is kind of like, do
Next
you
line,
want to
yeah.
save this individually as a file?
There you go.
Or do
Okay,
you want to
now
create
push
a whole
load.
level and then save the whole level as a file? So right now you're
Okay,
saving
now you
individual
can
objects
watch
as
it.
files.
And
I'm
make
pretty
sure it's
if you run it again, it's just gonna
creating and returning the things
create
you
a new
expect.
model with this one. Same object.
So data,
It was always
yeah,
an
so what
override
makes
that
sense?
one. Which,
Nothing, right?
because I'm set it saying like,
Right.
oh, let's say test.json, so I need to
There's no
get the
request
information, get the
body or
ID
anything.
of them and see if they use the same override
So
it.
that's
It's
okay.
not like create a new object.
step over and
do
see
it
what you
with
get.
JSON.
Those are one. Do you wanna? You may wanna have a object name and then from the object name create a path.
Okay, that's part of the test, yeah.
So
Yeah, but also the
This is
like
calling
you
it.
want to save objects or do you want to save levels? So the idea is you have one big, if you have one
Play
big
it again.
object, that is your level. It has a level name, level background, and then it has an array of all the different types. Then you save that. That's that way you have one file per level.
Next one over.
Yeah, and the name will be like level one or not.
There we go. Now look at data.
Okay, I have it.
If you got this running already. So
teacher where
it's
set,
Okay.
it's set
So what that promise is
gonna
is
be
the
not gonna
file
do
system
Yeah.
is trying to
So
read the
then
file
like a lot of stuff I
asynchronously.
do. My ideas and then
And
start
so it's
to
going to
do that.
return right away,
Friday,
but it hasn't found the file, and
each
it
of
hasn't
the
read all the data in the file.
If you have like
Eight.
So you have to wait for it.
That's hard.
You have to wait for it to
At least
finish.
Friday was also
So
last time.
when you look at the file system, you know how it has file system async,
Well,
which is
it's like the
default,
BBB
and
and
sync.
hate. I'm log in
the
the
sync calls
Like
because
you say,
they'll wait.
you're checking it first.
So I say file system.
No, I'm not
So
that
you
fine of
file
play. I hate those guys. It's so dumb. They just
You
run
have
towards you.
documentation. We have file system documentation in the browser.
I mean, I can see here.
Yeah, so you need to like and or some other numbers that you
No, yeah.
zero.
Yeah, that one.
So for the first question, you need to or and another number. And that other number.
Discover a nice weak level fast and start.
Dragon?
Yeah, the
So
dragon.
for the and
Just
should
use
be
some weak
zero.
weapon that
Yes,
just
the
when
first
they
one
have
is
the
zero. And the and should be from
It'll reload. You'll have to push play here.
Or that's the first thing. I hate that weapon that does like in the ground.
And you need to do that.
Of
Then you have a different number for each position.
Yeah, something like that just stomps on the ground. That's really OP, you know. That's a fixed amount of damage, not based on any scale. So, something good. Yeah, so
That's what you get for playing PG this whole game.
Yeah,
The
I
game's meant for playing it alone.
I get angry at playing the game, but you know,
It is literally.
just go back and play the old one. You'll see
So
how
you
it's
can't
feel
find
better.
a file called number one
But you know
because
what?
there's
The
no
open world is
extension.
nice for playing like.
So save them as .json files and put .json on the end of the file name.
Now they feel like if you know where to.
So,
it feels good to
save on
your first
JSON.
because then
Yeah.
you're kind of like it's cool.
Because that's
right.
what,
And I thought,
but where it says read file sync level slash level one,
Yeah.
and then level one, make it level one .json.
Definitely.
Read file sync,
Yeah, definitely. For my first playthrough,
It needs to fully qualify.
there was like some like a million players search the second half, and they wanted to run on the
Let's see if
back.
that'll go.
Second playthrough is kind of like, oh, because I know I grabbed it and recruited my group, so I'll be like, where the hell was my play? Like, okay, here. Where is this thing? Okay.
Save it.
Just kind of skip the thing. I'm pretty not missing a bunch of puzzles that is now consistent. Yeah, there's not that many. The quest lines and stuff. Yeah, it is the idea one.
That's okay. When you push low level, it should pop.
That's all. And there's a buggy in there, quest lines, like halfway through it, and then I realized that
Got it?
if you don't start the third sequence,
You got it. Thank you.
before you do certain
Okay.
things, you can't finish the set just because there's not enough.
Kind of cool now that you know how to do it. The hard part is really
To get it, yeah. I understand.
when you push save, what
What
kind of method do you have to write to grab the editor div and walk through everything inside it and create the data structure you want to send? That's going to take a little bit of
Can I just, so this name, can I just limit it to all the levels? So just
Yeah.
drop, we call it,
Where
Yes.
Oh, is that?
Yes. Yeah.
drop down,
You know how to do a selection list?
drop down.
Yeah. You know where you do a select and then option, and you just use the values are the file names.
So they're all gonna be
Chris
equivalent.
probably think it's
One,
delicious since
then
everyone like
click.
forgets to.
Well, you can
Print
even
some forms.
let the user edit to them.
Doesn't matter. When I started, that was the first thing they told us, like, oh, there's no forms.
So I
there's
will
not
not
gonna be any forms.
make it
Bring your own forms.
API
build those
request
in.
for the whole.
Because everyone wants to be on files apparently.
I'll just
Got it. Now it's
have them
decent.
on level.
You're right. There's only
One
seven.
and.
Oh, that makes sense. Like it's not-
But you can-
But the user wouldn't
Can
know if
probably
it exists or not.
be
So
part of it.
No,
They
so
don't do
you
it
wouldn't know
themselves.
if you
It's
override
maybe part of that.
You're right. So what I would do is
That part
have
aspect is.
your selection
There's a
list
curriculum now?
filled
Yeah.
in. So you make a request to the server.
Yeah, that is.
You get the list of all the levels. You create the select list.
Yeah, that makes it overwhelming.
Then you have a new level button.
It is a bit overwhelming.
And the new level button lets you have a field to type in the level name.
Not a good workout.
And you check the level name against the level names that are in the select list.
Okay.
And if it's unique, if it isn't in the select list, then you let them create that level. You add it to the select list. You make the level name whatever they typed. If the level name exists, you just pop up an error that says you can't use that level name. It already exists.
Okay, for example, if I have this select list
Yeah.
and I have right off the bat level 1 to 10, for example, but only 4 levels exist in the server. So, and I choose, for example, level 6. And then I send the API
arbitrary length for this. That's not a custom word mark.
Sorry.
Because if you start with an empty list, you get them in there in the first place. Yeah, so like if I
Stealing language,
this,
stealing a noun part, they're more popular.
Let's see if I can. So. Let's just do that. And then in here, okay,
You guys have the orientation integration?
I'm gonna make this. Can't type. Make that dynamic. So I'm gonna grab this level names.
If you're interested, because it is, there was some things I thought I knew when it first came, and I just went to one of them and dropped a bunch of info that I didn't consider. So that might be a little bit.
Okay.
There's some options, but yeah, like take a look at it if it's complex. They also have service where.
So let's do.
They kind of give you a big overview, and then they kind of teach you their service, which is
Right.
might be great business. Like it goes down your case and work for you. A lot of people use local services to look at immigration, how hard the process. Yeah, I think it's complex. Like,
So I'm gonna hang on to that for a second. I'm gonna work backwards, right?
Yeah. What if I have jQuery and JavaScript in the same
It'll work just fine.
Yeah, but
Consistency-wise, it looks like crap.
yeah.
It's hard, but
All we need here
yeah,
jQuery, and I started already on JavaScript.
yeah. It's part of the reason why I use query selector is because imagine if I did this.
You go online, you go, okay, I want to go for a while, like 4 years, 5 years ago, they had added a visa from Mexico. At that point, I was annoying, so I still have it in the past. Just like the visa that says like expires something like that.
It's a little bit close.
They just removed it after. I think they realized
It's pretty damn close all of a sudden, right? The biggest difference is you then have to replace on with add event listener. But there's a bunch of helper functions in jQuery that really are helpful, but other than that, it's not. And that only works if you use query selector instead of get element by ID or get element by class. So that's kind of a cheeky, cheesy way to simulate jQuery. But you got to use jQuery. Well, you don't have to, but it's easier to use jQuery to do this. Because that's what the API says to do.
Now you can see how much each loading takes. You'll realize like, oh, when it's loading for the loading jQuery might take like 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And that's, and if you're just using selectors, you're wasting a lot of time just loading something you don't need. Because jQuery has
And let's do this.
all of them. Yeah, a lot of people will get used to, say, using the selector. They would import all of jQuery just for the selector. So you're loading something that might take 3
why are we JSON parse the result if we are already starting in
I
JSON?
didn't know, but you can.
When I request the level list, it's going to give me a JSON string back with the list of all the files in it. I got to turn that into a JavaScript object to pull the bits out of
So
it.
you know how your
Oh,
low
it's
folder
level list.
I'm in the client, right?
If you want, you can set it so that it simulates like a slow 3D connection.
And then I'm going to go,
Slow Wi-Fi. And then you can see, oh, it's taking really long to load. Why? You check. Oh, my CSS is really
the
big.
data's an array, isn't
My
it?
image folder is too big. Or this API I'm calling is really
Payload.
slow.
And I can even go this, I can go super crazy. How's this?
Double button.
Loading, I'm like, oh god. It's ridiculous. There's no data like that. Parse. Yeah, so like parse. Yeah, once you bring in the string, JSON as a string, you parse it and move the object back. So basically you can go object to string with string type, and then string to object with parse.
And then maybe I'm gonna go,
Item in file list, and file list is payload,
yeah.
and the payload is the whole form.
Well, you have to write it to do this, but it says, make the response say payload, and then there's an array, right?
Wait,
So
get
there's
level
things like
list,
you stuff. I thought it was
payload,
very fine, and you can just use the
name,
object
file
and
name,
love Excel.
name, file
It's easy
name,
enough.
or
Most
just
easier is just adding a parse and
file name, file.
You know, I said change the names to hard code them to .json. This means you don't have to hard code them, you can just make them whatever you want. Because the full file name's in there.
They're always the same, right? Oh, in my case, they will be always the same. So I can just use.
Yeah, I mean, if you're quick, you can make these the same,
Yes.
right?
Yes. what
But
else?
this spec, like reading it like that and returning it like that, means your data that you respond, your server will work with any client. Because every client expects the data to come back like this.
Yeah, the JSON will have a name and file name. I understand.
Yeah.
So, but I can use the.
Oh yeah,
obvious
yeah,
data,
you can
right?
use the same names. Yeah, I use the same name. I don't make them different. Right. But then I'm just gonna do this. Think of it as the name is the presentation name and the file name is the actual value. So you might do something like that. And then I'll probably do it outside. Fingers are just not working.
It's cold. I love the triple P. Up with the pen.
Actually, probably won't do it this way. if I wanted to be really crazy,
Select list not getting highlighted. Very thorough error handling there.
so that's kind of the whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
Just throwing in options drop down so they can choose.
Yeah.
Oh, we need to put that
And by
one.
setting the file
So
name
we
as
have
the
the
value, I
options.
know that if someone chooses one, I can have an event handler on the select list
Yeah.
that does an on change.
When the value changes.
As soon as the value changes, I go grab the value and go post the load request for that file name.
This post is just coming from that event listener on the option.
Solve the level error. It's supposed to be 1280.
Level names is that drop down option? Yeah, right. The ID level names.
Which one?
Just that.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah, I just created it now.
So what's the level error
Oh, yeah,
like?
12.
Dimensions. So like, oh, it's 1280 for 7 seconds.
Well, to figure out, I was playing with the Dragamon right now.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the event and what the information it gives you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to that it gives you the position but not related to the whole screen, just from the parent div? So it's giving to me. Let me show you. Let's bring it.
Yeah.
That's right. But it seems to be-
I'm gonna use my laptop.
But that's just change the class to on the side, so that's easier. And then that's buttons like
Everything
read
that's running?
level, save
Yeah.
level, delete level, country.
For now, I'm just unloading it after. Here.
Oh, because
So,
of these games. You played the Angry Birds before?
like I found all of these, right?
Right.
Context,
Yeah,
but
so
that's
what,
in
for
relation
example,
to
you
this.
get the minimum
So
score,
like if
that's
I
the level. For example, if I
move
get
it all the
at
way
least
here,
1,000
as close to the
points,
edge as
then
possible.
Yeah.
the level. If I get 2,000,
It gives me
two
that
stars,
is gonna
if I
be
get 3,000,
close to
then
0, 0.
It's in relation to the client area of the browser if the positioning is relative.
a certain field view.
Mhm.
So it's based on the position.
Next shot.
So absolute and relative positioning will be
Okay, it's
the
different.
client X and Y should be in relationship to the upper left corner,
Yeah.
which is different on Firefox than Chrome.
So Firefox comes from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Oh no.
So just to be different,
And then as David, like Tuesday today.
Chrome, this is the origin.
Uh huh.
Firefox, it's here.
Oh yeah, it gives the whole
But
bar,
David's
right?
a nice guy.
The whole toolbar is something you can manipulate.
Are you planning to start doing that on the weekend, I presume, as well? Maybe. Like you said, this is a cardless one, so you have to spend extra time.
Oh yeah.
Kind of.
150 pixels down.
It's an old man.
Right?
It,
Oh, wait.
it's one of those things that always
No, here it is. Client X and Y stay the same.
I think it is. David, I think there's a pretty printer on the
Client X and Y over here still
Is it
Yeah.
this one?
0, 0.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because, but look at the page and the screen X and Y.
And the
Oh, okay,
screen
that's not a specific area.
1000. Is it counting from here?
Bizarre, right?
That's weird.
This is why I ended up printing them all on the screen when I was first trying to sort it out.
Which way everything.
Oh, I'd drag something and drop it here when I first did it and pop up over there. And I'm like, what's going on? And I spent half a day trying to make my head rationalize the 4 different coordinates before finally I just like, fuck it, I'm gonna put them on the screen. I had one little debug tool where I was drawing a full crosshair.
Wherever it was going to drop it.
Right, so I was using CSS to build
Build crosshair.
borders
Uh huh.
on full-size divs too.
Also, it was like the whole light here, whole light
Yeah.
here. I mean, it works.
Yeah, it was a little bit painful, and then you know, the offset part works, but it's only an offset compared to its parent. And then the screen versus page was the one that messed me completely, because there's times when you think you want it relative to the page.
The way I was thinking, I had this div, and inside of it, everything is relative. So I was thinking, okay, I'm gonna position it relative to this square. This is the way it should be, right?
Yeah, and the other thing that's weird when you use the layout tools is that if you make an absolute position thing inside a relative position thing inside an absolute position thing, then the absolute positions on the most innermost thing are absolute relative to the relative parent div.
Yeah.
But if you don't do that and you just make an absolute thing, it's absolute compared to like the upper left corner of the entire browser, which is just like,
Yeah, if I make an absolute,
that makes no sense.
if I put this absolute div down right here, and inside of that another absolute div, and I give it like 50-50, it will be 50-50 over here.
So the upside I find is that the modern JavaScript stuff is actually doing some really nice things. The legacy stuff, which of course no one's ever willing to get rid of, creates a bunch of weirdness. Yeah, I'll share a little video. I wonder if it's easy to find.
What? You might have to be a little bit more descriptive.
Nope.
Tutorial software.
That's it.